For 3 years, Sarah Mitchell couldn't get out of bed without crying, couldn't eat a meal without choking on her tears, and couldn't look in the mirror without seeing a broken woman who had lost everything that mattered, until one conversation changed her life forever and led her to save hundreds of other women from the same devastating darkness that nearly destroyed her. Hello, my dear friends. It's always such a joy to be here with you, sharing these incredible stories of courage and transformation that remind us just how resilient the human spirit truly is. You know, after 68 years of living, I've learned that life has a way of testing us when we least expect it. And sometimes those tests come in the form of losses so profound that we wonder if we'll ever find our way back to who we used to be. Today's story comes from Sarah. She's 50 years old from Atlanta, Georgia, and she's a widow. But her journey from devastating loss to remarkable purpose is going to touch your heart in ways you might not expect. Before we dive deep into Sarah's incredible transformation, I want you to do me a favor. Please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel family so you never miss these inspiring stories, and leave me a comment telling me what you think about Sarah's journey. And please don't leave this video early because the ending of this story is absolutely breathtaking and will leave you with tears of hope in your eyes. But before we begin today's story, I always like to share something special with you that might help. I've left some wonderful natural products in the description that have been such a blessing in my life and might help you too. These are products I personally use and recommend for various health concerns like sleep, joint comfort, energy, and overall wellness. Just click the link in the description to learn more and support our channel family. Now let me tell you about Sarah Mitchell. Picture a woman who, at 47, thought she had life beautifully mapped out. She lived in a charming 2-story home in the suburbs of Atlanta with her husband David, a gentle soul who worked as an engineer for nearly 30 years. They had been married for 28 wonderful years, the kind of marriage that makes other couples a little envious because you could see the love in every glance they shared. Sarah worked as a head librarian at the local elementary school, a job she absolutely adored. There's something so peaceful about being surrounded by books and helping children discover the magic of reading, don't you think? She would tell me later that those quiet moments in the library, helping a shy child find the perfect book, were some of her happiest times. David and Sarah had raised the 2 beautiful children together. Their daughter Jessica was 25 and working as a nurse in nearby Savannah, and their son Michael was 23, just starting his career in marketing in Charlotte, North Carolina. Both children had grown into wonderful adults, and Sarah and David were so proud of the family they had built together. You know, my loves, when I think about Sarah and David's relationship, it reminds me of my own dear husband, Harold. We had that same comfortable love, the kind where you don't need words to understand each other. David would bring Sarah coffee every morning before work, made exactly the way she liked it, with just a touch of cream and a sprinkle of cinnamon. Such a small gesture, but oh, how those little acts of love matter. They had plans, beautiful plans for their future. David was going to retire at 55, just 3 years away, and they were going to travel. They had a whole list of places they wanted to see together. Ireland, where David's grandparents came from. Italy for the art and food that Sarah dreamed about. And a cross-country RV trip to visit all the national parks. They even had a folder full of brochures and a savings account they called their Adventure Fund. Sarah often told her friends that she felt like the luckiest woman alive. She had a husband who still held her hand during movies, children who called her regularly just to chat, and a job that felt more like a calling than work. At 47, she was looking forward to the next chapter of their lives together. But life, my dear friends, doesn't always follow our carefully laid plans. Sometimes it takes a sharp, unexpected turn that leaves us gasping for breath and wondering how we'll ever find our footing again. It was a Tuesday morning in March, a day that started like any other. Sarah woke up to the sound of David's alarm at 6:30. He was always an early riser, liked to have time for his coffee, and to read the news before heading to work. She could hear him moving around in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of their morning routine. The coffee maker gurgling to life, the newspaper rustling, the gentle clink of his favorite mug. Sarah took her time getting ready that morning. She remembered choosing a blue sweater that David always complimented her on, and she even put on a little extra mascara because they had plans to meet for lunch that day. David had suggested they try that new Italian place downtown, and Sarah was looking forward to spending their lunch hour together, something they didn't do nearly often enough. She kissed him goodbye at 7:15, just like she had thousands of mornings before. "Have a good day, sweetheart," she said, adjusting his tie slightly. "I love you." He smiled that warm smile that had captured her heart 29 years earlier when they met at a college library. How fitting, considering her future career. "Love you too, beautiful. See you at lunch." Those were the last words they would ever speak to each other. You know, my loves, I've learned that life can change in the space of a heartbeat. One moment you're making lunch plans with the person you love most in the world, and the next moment, everything you thought you knew about your life comes crashing down around you. Sarah was in the middle of reading a story to her kindergarten class when the school secretary appeared in her doorway with a look that Sarah would later describe as the moment she knew her world was about to shatter. The secretary's face was pale, and she was holding a piece of paper with trembling hands. "Sarah," she whispered, "you need to come to the office. There's been a call." I can only imagine the fear that must have gripped Sarah's heart in that moment. We all know that feeling when we sense something terrible is coming, when our intuition screams at us that everything is about to change. Sarah later told me that she felt like she was moving through water as she followed the secretary down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The call was from David's supervisor at the engineering firm. David had collapsed at his desk around 10:30 that morning. A massive heart attack, sudden and devastating. By the time the paramedics arrived, there was nothing they could do. He was only 52 years old, in seemingly perfect health. No warning signs, no previous heart problems, nothing that could have prepared them for this moment. Sarah's legs gave out when she heard the words. She actually fell to the floor in the principal's office, a sound escaping from her throat that she didn't even recognize as her own voice. It was the sound of a heart breaking, the sound of a future being ripped away in an instant. The principal, a kind woman named Mrs. Henderson, helped Sarah to a chair and stayed with her while she made the impossible phone calls. First to Jessica, who immediately started the 3-hour drive from Savannah, then to Michael, who caught the first flight he could find from Charlotte. Each conversation was agony, having to say the words out loud, making David's death real in a way that felt unbearable. "You know, my dear friends, I remember when I lost my Harold 15 years ago. It was different circumstances. He had been battling cancer for 2 years, so we had time to prepare, time to say goodbye. But even with that preparation, the moment he took his last breath, I felt like someone had torn a piece of my soul right out of my body. I can only imagine how much more devastating it must have been for Sarah, with no warning, no chance to say goodbye, no final moments together. Sarah told me later that the rest of that day felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold. She remembered fragments: Jessica arriving with red, swollen eyes, Michael walking through the front door looking lost and confused, neighbors bringing casseroles that no one could eat, the funeral director asking questions that seemed impossible to answer. How do you plan a funeral for someone who was supposed to grow old with you? How do you choose flowers for the love of your life when you can barely remember how to breathe? How do you write an obituary that captures 28 years of shared dreams and quiet moments and inside jokes that only the two of you understood? Sarah felt like she was drowning in a sea of decisions and condolences and practical matters that needed attention when all she wanted to do was curl up in David's favorite chair and pretend this was all a terrible nightmare that she would wake up from. The funeral was a blur of faces and flowers and people telling her what a wonderful man David was, as if she didn't already know that better than anyone. Jessica and Michael stayed with her for 2 weeks, handling the endless paperwork and phone calls that death seems to require. But eventually, life called them back to their own responsibilities, and Sarah found herself alone in the house that had been filled with so much love and laughter. That's when the real journey began, my loves. That's when Sarah discovered just how deep grief can go and how it can change everything about who you thought you were. But it's also when she began the long, difficult path toward finding herself again. Though she didn't know it at the time, the silence in the house was deafening. Every room held memories that felt both precious and painful. David's coffee mug still sat in the sink because Sarah couldn't bear to wash it. His pillow still smelled like his aftershave, and Sarah found herself sleeping on his side of the bed just to feel closer to him. She took a leave of absence from the library, telling herself it would just be for a few weeks until she felt stronger. But weeks turned into months, and Sarah found that getting out of bed each morning felt like climbing a mountain. The simple tasks that had once been automatic, making breakfast, checking the mail, returning phone calls, now seemed impossibly difficult. This, my dear friends, was just the beginning of Sarah's journey through the valley of grief. But I want you to hold on to hope as we continue her story, because even in her darkest moments, there were seeds of transformation being planted that would eventually bloom into something beautiful and purposeful. Sarah's story reminds me that sometimes we have to lose everything we thought we needed in order to discover what we're truly capable of. And sometimes our greatest pain becomes the birthplace of our greatest purpose. Please don't leave this video, my loves, because what Sarah discovered about herself in the coming months is going to touch your heart deeply and show you just how powerful the human spirit can be, even when it feels completely broken. The first month after David's death passed like a haze of sleepless nights and endless tears. Sarah found herself going through the motions of living without really being alive. She would wake up each morning, for just a split second, forgetting that David was gone, reaching across the bed to touch his arm, only to find cold, empty sheets. That moment of remembering every single day felt like losing him all over again. Jessica called every morning at 8 o'clock sharp, and Michael called every evening at 6. They were trying so hard to take care of their mother, but Sarah could hear the worry in their voices, the way they spoke to her, like she might break if they said the wrong thing. And maybe they were right to be worried, because some days, Sarah felt like she was held together by nothing more than the thinnest thread. You know, my dear friends, when I think about those early days of Sarah's grief, it reminds me of something I learned when my own mother passed away many years ago. Grief isn't just sadness. It's exhaustion. It's confusion. It's feeling lost in your own life. Sarah told me that she would stand in the grocery store, staring at shelves of food, completely unable to remember what she needed or even why she was there. The simplest decisions felt impossible when the person you shared every decision with for 28 years was suddenly gone. Sarah's sister, Linda, who lived about an hour away in Marietta, started coming over twice a week. Linda meant well, bless her heart, but she was one of those people who believed that staying busy was the cure for everything. She would arrive with cleaning supplies and a cheerful voice, talking about getting Sarah back to normal and moving forward. "Sarah, honey, you can't just sit in this house forever," Linda would say, folding laundry that Sarah hadn't even realized needed folding. "David wouldn't want you to waste away like this. You need to get back to work, get back to your routine." The children at the library miss you. But what Linda didn't understand, what a lot of people don't understand about grief, is that there is no back to normal when the person who was your normal is gone forever. Sarah wasn't the same person she had been when David was alive, and she was beginning to realize that she never would be again. The leave of absence from the library was supposed to be temporary, just a few weeks to get through the funeral and handle David's affairs. But as those weeks turned into months, Sarah found that the thought of returning to work filled her with panic. How could she read cheerful stories to children when her own story had become so sad? How could she help other people find the books they needed when she couldn't even find her way through her own days? Mrs. Patterson, the school principal, was incredibly understanding. She called Sarah personally every few weeks, always with the same gentle message. Take all the time you need, Sarah. Your job will be here when you're ready. But Sarah was beginning to wonder if she would ever be ready for anything again. The nights were the worst. During the day, she could at least pretend to be busy, sorting through David's belongings, answering sympathy cards, dealing with insurance companies and lawyers. But at night, when the house grew quiet and dark, the reality of her loneliness would hit her like a physical weight on her chest. She started sleeping in David's recliner in the living room because their bed felt too big, too empty. She would fall asleep with the television on, just for the sound of human voices, and wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning with a terrible ache in her neck and an even worse ache in her heart. Sarah stopped cooking real meals. What was the point of making dinner for one person? She lived on crackers and cheese, canned soup that she ate cold from the can, and the endless casseroles that well-meaning neighbors continued to bring. Her clothes started hanging loose on her frame, and when Jessica came to visit, Sarah could see the shock and worry in her daughter's eyes. "Mom, you're disappearing," Jessica said one afternoon, sitting on the couch where Sarah spent most of her days. "Dad wouldn't want this for you. He'd want you to take care of yourself. But that's the thing about grief, my loves. It makes you feel like taking care of yourself is a betrayal of the person you've lost." Sarah felt guilty every time she laughed at something on television. Guilty when she enjoyed the taste of her morning coffee. Guilty when she went a whole hour without thinking about David. How could she move forward with her life when his had ended so abruptly? 3 months after David's death, Sarah made a decision that would mark the beginning of her descent into a much darker place. She decided to quit her job at the library permanently. She called Mrs. Patterson on a Monday morning and gave her resignation over the phone, her voice flat and emotionless. "Sarah, are you sure about this?" Mrs. Patterson asked, clearly concerned. "Maybe you could start back part-time, just a few hours a week. The children have been asking about you." But Sarah was sure. She couldn't imagine ever feeling joy again, and working with children required a kind of lightness that she was certain she'd lost forever. "I'm sure," she told Mrs. Patterson. "Thank you for everything, but I won't be coming back." After hanging up the phone, Sarah felt a strange sense of relief mixed with terror. She had just severed her last connection to the person she used to be, and now she was truly adrift. The next 6 months were a slow slide into what Sarah would later recognize as severe depression, though at the time she just thought of it as reality. She stopped answering the phone unless it was Jessica or Michael. She stopped going to the grocery store, instead having everything delivered. She stopped showering regularly, stopped caring about her appearance, stopped caring about much of anything. You know, my dear friends, I want to pause here and talk about something important. Depression after a major loss isn't uncommon, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. Sarah wasn't weak or selfish or ungrateful for the blessings she still had in her life. She was a human being whose world had been completely upended, whose brain and heart were trying to process an unprocessable loss. I remember feeling something similar after my Harold passed, though thankfully, not to the same extent. There were days when I wondered what the point of getting dressed was, when I questioned whether anything I did mattered anymore. The difference was that I had my church community, my longtime friends, and I forced myself to stay connected even when I didn't want to. Sarah, unfortunately, began to isolate herself from everyone and everything that might have helped her. She stopped going to church, even though she and David had attended the same Methodist church for 15 years. The pastor, Reverend Williams, called several times and even stopped by the house, but Sarah pretended not to be home. She couldn't bear the thought of sitting in their usual pew, seeing the sympathy in people's faces, hearing them say things like, "David's in a better place now," or "Everything happens for a reason." Sarah's friends from work tried to maintain contact for a while. They would call and invite her to lunch, to movies, to their book club meetings. But Sarah always had an excuse. She wasn't feeling well. She had appointments. She just wasn't ready. Eventually, most of them stopped calling, which only confirmed what Sarah was beginning to believe about herself, that she was broken beyond repair, that she had nothing to offer anyone anymore. The house began to reflect Sarah's internal state. Mail piled up on the kitchen counter, unopened and ignored. Dishes sat in the sink for days. The beautiful flower beds that David had tended so lovingly became overgrown with weeds. The grass grew long and unkempt because Sarah couldn't bear to hire someone to do the job that David had always done with such pride. Jessica and Michael grew increasingly worried. They tag-teamed their phone calls and visits, trying to create a net of support around their mother. But Sarah seemed determined to push them away too. "I'm fine," she would tell them, which became her standard response to any expression of concern. "I just need time." But time, Sarah was discovering, wasn't healing anything. If anything, the passage of time was making things worse because each day that passed was just another day further away from her last moment with David, another day in which she had to live without him. This is when Sarah's story takes an even more difficult turn. My loves, but I need you to stay with me, because understanding the depth of her struggle is crucial to appreciating the magnitude of her eventual transformation. Now, I want you to leave me a comment telling me what you think is going to happen at the end of Sarah's story, because what comes next is going to surprise you and show you that even in our darkest moments, there are angels placed in our path. But before we continue, let me share something personal with you. During my own difficult times, I discovered some wonderful natural supplements that have been such a blessing for sleep, stress relief, and overall wellness. You can find these special products in the description below. They're things I personally use and recommend. Just click the link to learn more and support our channel family. 1 year after David's death, Sarah had reached what she would later describe as rock bottom. She was barely functioning as a human being. Some days she didn't get out of bed at all. She had lost nearly 30 pounds. Her hair had grown long and unkempt, and her house had become a reflection of her inner chaos. It was Jessica who finally forced the intervention that would begin to change everything. Jessica had been growing increasingly frightened by her mother's condition. During her weekly visits, she watched Sarah disappearing a little more each time. Her vibrant, caring mother had been replaced by someone who seemed to have given up on life entirely. Sarah would sit in David's recliner for hours, staring at nothing, barely responding when Jessica spoke to her. "Mom," Jessica said one Saturday morning in March, exactly 1 year after David's death, "we need to talk." Sarah was in her usual spot in the recliner, wearing the same clothes she'd worn for 3 days. She looked at Jessica with dull, lifeless eyes. "What about, honey?" Jessica sat down on the coffee table in front of her mother, forcing eye contact. "About the fact that you're dying, Mom. Not physically, but in every other way that matters. And I can't watch it anymore." Sarah blinked slowly. "I'm not dying, Jessica. I'm just tired." "No, Mom. You're not tired. You're giving up. And Dad would be heartbroken if he could see you like this." For the first time in months, Sarah showed a flash of emotion. Anger. "Don't you dare tell me what your father would want. You don't know what it's like to lose the person you plan to spend the rest of your life with." You don't know what it's like to wake up every morning and remember that he's never coming back." Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. "You're right. I don't know what that's like, but I do know what it's like to watch my mother disappear. I do know what it's like to be scared that I'm going to lose both my parents when I've already lost my dad." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock that David had loved so much. As Sarah stared at her daughter, seeing her clearly for the first time in months, Jessica looked exhausted, older than her 26 years, and Sarah realized with a shock that her grief was affecting more people than just herself. "Mom," Jessica continued, her voice softer now, "I found the name of a grief counselor, Dr. Martinez. She specializes in helping people who've lost their spouses. Will you please just try talking to her? Just once." Sarah's first instinct was to say no, to retreat back into the cocoon of numbness that had become her comfort zone. But looking at Jessica's face, seeing the pain and fear there, something stirred in Sarah's heart, a tiny flicker of the mother she used to be. "I don't know if talking will help," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe it won't," Jessica agreed. "But what you're doing now definitely isn't helping. And Mom, if you can't do it for yourself, please do it for me and Michael. We're scared we're going to lose you too." That night, Sarah lay in David's recliner, unable to sleep, thinking about what Jessica had said. She tried to remember the last time she had really looked at herself in a mirror, the last time she had cared about anything outside of her own pain. She couldn't remember, and that realization was almost as scary as the grief itself. The next morning, Sarah did something she hadn't done in months. She took a shower. It was a small step, but as she stood under the hot water, washing her hair for the first time in weeks, she felt something shift slightly. Not hope, exactly, but maybe the tiniest possibility that hope might exist somewhere in her future. She called Dr. Martinez that afternoon. Dr. Elena Martinez was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Sarah at ease, or as at ease as she could be, in such an unfamiliar situation. Her office was warm and comfortable, with soft lighting and tissues strategically placed within easy reach. "Sarah, Doctor," Martinez said during that first session, "can you tell me about David?" It was such a simple question, but it opened something in Sarah that had been locked away for months. For the first time since the funeral, she talked about David not as someone she had lost, but as someone she had loved. She told Dr. Martinez about their morning coffee ritual, about how he would leave little notes in her lunch when she was having a difficult day at work, about how he could make her laugh even when she was stressed or upset. "He sounds like he was a wonderful man," Dr. Martinez said when Sarah finished. "He was," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He really was." "Sarah, I want you to understand something important," Dr. Martinez continued. "Loving David, missing him, grieving for him, none of that has to stop just because you start taking care of yourself again. Grief isn't something you get over, like a cold or the flu. It's something you learn to carry differently." This concept was revolutionary to Sarah. For a year, she had believed that moving forward in any way meant leaving David behind, meant betraying their love. But Dr. Martinez was suggesting that she could honor David's memory by living, not by slowly fading away. "What would David want for you?" Dr. Martinez asked. Sarah didn't have to think about her answer. "He'd want me to be happy. He always said that my happiness was his happiness." "Then maybe," Dr. Martinez suggested gently, "learning to live again isn't a betrayal of David's memory. Maybe it's the greatest honor you could give him." Sarah began seeing Dr. Martinez twice a week. It wasn't easy. Some sessions left her feeling raw and exhausted, as if old wounds had been reopened. But slowly, very slowly, she began to remember who she had been before grief consumed her. She started taking care of her appearance again, not because she cared how she looked, but because Dr. Martinez helped her understand that self-care was a form of self-respect. She began eating regular meals, sleeping in her own bed instead of David's chair, and answering the phone when friends called. 3 months into therapy, Dr. Martinez suggested something that terrified Sarah: joining a grief support group. "I don't want to sit around with a bunch of people talking about how sad we all are," Sarah protested. "It's not about wallowing in sadness," Dr. Martinez explained. "It's about realizing that you're not alone in this experience. There are other people who understand exactly what you're going through, people who can offer insights that I, as someone who hasn't lost a spouse, simply can't provide." Sarah resisted the idea for weeks, but eventually, her trust in Dr. Martinez won out. On a Thursday evening in July, 2 years after David's death, Sarah walked nervously into the community center where the grief support group met. The group was smaller than she had expected, just 8 people, ranging in age from their 40s to their 70s. They sat in a circle in a comfortable room, and Sarah was struck by how normal they all looked. She had somehow expected grief to be more visible, to mark people in obvious ways. The group leader was a woman named Barbara, who had lost her husband 5 years earlier. Barbara had a warmth about her that reminded Sarah of her own mother, and she made Sarah feel welcome without making a big fuss about her being new. "We start each session by checking in," Barbara explained to Sarah. "Everyone shares how their week has been, any challenges they've faced, any small victories they want to celebrate. There's no pressure to share until you're ready." Sarah listened as the other members talked about their weeks. There was Tom, whose wife had died of cancer 8 months earlier. Helen, who had lost her husband in a car accident 3 years ago. Margaret, a 70-year-old woman whose husband had passed from Alzheimer's the previous year. What struck Sarah most was that these people were talking about their deceased spouses, not just with sadness, but with love, with humor, with warmth. Tom told a funny story about trying to cook his late wife's famous lasagna recipe and setting off the smoke alarm. Helen talked about planting a garden in her husband's memory and how therapeutic she found working in the soil. And then there was Margaret. Something about this older woman captured Sarah's attention immediately. Margaret had a serenity about her, a sense of peace that Sarah envied. When Margaret spoke about her husband, Robert, who had battled Alzheimer's for 6 years before his death, she did so with such grace and acceptance that Sarah found herself leaning forward to catch every word. "The hardest part wasn't losing Robert," Margaret said. "The hardest part was losing myself in the process of losing him. I spent so many years being Robert's caregiver that I forgot I was also Margaret, a person with my own interests and dreams and value." After the meeting, Margaret approached Sarah in the parking lot. "First meeting?" she asked with a gentle smile. Sarah nodded. "Is it that obvious?" "Only because I remember that shell-shocked look from my own first meeting." Margaret laughed. "I'm Margaret, by the way. Margaret Harrison." "Sarah Mitchell." "Sarah, would you like to get a cup of coffee? There's a lovely little cafe just down the street, and I find that sometimes the real healing happens in the conversations after the meetings." Sarah hesitated. She hadn't had coffee with a friend in over 2 years, but something about Margaret's kind eyes and gentle manner made her feel safe. "I'd like that," Sarah said, surprising herself. That coffee date changed everything for Sarah, though she didn't realize it at the time. Margaret shared her own story, how she had spent 6 years watching her beloved husband slowly disappear to Alzheimer's, how she had grieved his loss long before he actually died, and how she had struggled to remember who she was after his death. "I was so angry after Robert died," Margaret confided. "Angry at God, angry at the disease, angry at people who still had their husbands. I spent a year being furious at the world." "What changed?" Sarah asked. Margaret smiled. "I met a woman at the grocery store. She was probably 90 years old, struggling to reach something on a high shelf. I helped her, and we started talking. Turns out she had been widowed for 25 years and was living in a senior community nearby. She looked me right in the eye and said, 'Honey, you can spend the rest of your life being mad at death, or you can spend it being grateful for love. One will make you bitter, and the other will set you free.'" Sarah felt something shift inside her chest as Margaret spoke. It wasn't quite hope yet, but it was something, a tiny crack in the wall of grief that had surrounded her heart for 2 years. "How do you get to Grateful?" Sarah asked quietly. "Very slowly," Margaret said, "and with a lot of help from people who understand." That night, Sarah called Jessica. "Mom?" Jessica answered on the first ring, worry immediately evident in her voice. Late-night calls had become associated with crisis. "I'm okay, honey," Sarah said quickly. "I just wanted to tell you that I went to a support group tonight." Sarah could hear Jessica's sharp intake of breath. "How was it?" "Scary, sad, but also hopeful, maybe. I met a woman named Margaret who reminded me that there might be a life waiting for me on the other side of this grief." Jessica was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could hear her daughter crying softly. "Mom, I'm so proud of you. I'm not there yet, Jessica. I'm not okay yet. But maybe, for the first time in 2 years, I think I might be someday. That's enough, Mom. That's more than enough for now." As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that Dr. Martinez had been right. She wasn't leaving David behind by taking steps toward healing. She was honoring the love they had shared by refusing to let grief destroy the person he had loved so much. But Sarah's journey was far from over. In fact, that the most transformative part of her story was still to come, and it would involve Margaret in ways that Sarah could never have imagined. Sarah's friendship with Margaret deepened over the following months in ways that surprised both women. What had started as coffee after support group meetings evolved into regular phone calls, afternoon walks, and shared meals. Margaret became the mentor Sarah didn't know she needed, and Sarah became the daughter figure that Margaret had been missing since her own children lived far away. Margaret was unlike anyone Sarah had ever known. At 70 years old, she had a zest for life that seemed impossible for someone who had endured so much loss. She had cared for Robert through 6 devastating years of Alzheimer's, watching the brilliant man she had married slowly disappear. Yet somehow, she had emerged from that experience not bitter or broken, but with a deep appreciation for life's preciousness and an unshakable faith in the human capacity for resilience. "Tell me about Robert," Sarah said one afternoon, as they sat in Margaret's sunroom, watching birds at the feeder outside her window. Margaret's face lit up with the special glow that comes when someone talks about a deeply loved person. "Oh, Sarah, he was something special." Robert was a high school English teacher for 40 years. He had this way of making Shakespeare come alive for teenagers who thought they hated poetry. Even after he retired, former students would stop us in the grocery store to tell him how he had changed their lives. Sarah could hear the love in Margaret's voice, but also something else: acceptance, peace, even joy in the remembering. This was so different from how Sarah still felt when talking about David. Her memories were still wrapped in so much pain that she could barely access the happiness they had once brought her. "How do you do it?" Sarah asked. "How do you talk about him with such lightness? I still can't think about David without feeling like someone is squeezing my heart." Margaret set down her teacup and looked at Sarah with understanding eyes. "Oh, honey, it wasn't always like this. For the first year after Robert died, I couldn't even say his name without sobbing. But I learned something important from a very wise counselor. Our loved ones live on in our joy, not in our sorrow. Every time I smile remembering something funny Robert said, every time I feel grateful for the 45 years we had together, he's alive in that moment." This concept was revolutionary for Sarah. She had been so focused on the tragedy of losing David that she had forgotten the miracle of having had him at all. Margaret continued, "I started keeping what I call a gratitude journal. Every night before bed, I write down 3 things about Robert that I'm grateful for. Sometimes it's big things, like how he supported my dream of going back to school when I was 50. Sometimes it's tiny things, like how he always left me the last piece of chocolate cake. Focusing on gratitude instead of loss changed everything for me." Sarah went home that day and found an old notebook that she and David had used for grocery lists. That night, for the first time in 2.5 years, She wrote about David not as someone she had lost, but as someone she had been blessed to love. "I'm grateful that David always made the coffee in the morning because he knew I wasn't fully awake until after my first cup," she wrote. "I'm grateful for the way he would hum while he shaved. Always the same song, Blue Skies by Frank Sinatra. I'm grateful that he never once complained about my cold feet, touching his legs in bed." Writing those words, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since David's death. She smiled, a real, genuine smile, as she remembered his mock-dramatic protests about her popsicle feet and how he would always warm them between his hands anyway. The support group became a cornerstone of Sarah's healing. She looked forward to Thursday evenings, to the circle of people who understood her grief without explanation. She began sharing more in the meetings, talking about her struggles, but also about her small victories. "I cooked a real meal last week," she told the group one evening. "David's favorite, pot roast with carrots and potatoes. I was worried it would make me sad, but instead I felt close to him, like I was honoring our life together instead of just mourning its end." Tom, who had initially seemed so broken when Sarah first joined the group, was also making progress. "I finally cleaned out Linda's closet," he shared. "I kept a few special things, but I donated most of her clothes to the women's shelter. She would have loved knowing that her beautiful things were helping other women feel confident and valued." Helen had started dating again, which initially shocked some of the newer group members. "I was so afraid that people would think I didn't love my husband enough if I found companionship with someone else," she explained. "But Margaret helped me understand that the capacity to love again is actually a testament to the love we shared with our spouses. They taught us how to love well." Margaret had become the unofficial grandmother of the group, offering wisdom and perspective that came from being further along in her grief journey. But it was during Sarah's 6th month in the group that Margaret shared something that would change both of their lives forever. "I've been thinking about something," Margaret said after one particularly emotional meeting where they had welcomed 3 new members, all recent widows who were in the early devastating stages of grief. "I keep seeing women come into this group who are exactly where I was 3 years ago, where Sarah was a year ago. They're so lost, so broken, so convinced that they'll never feel normal again." Barbara, the group leader, nodded. "It's hard to remember those early days when you're feeling stronger, but it's important for new members to see that healing is possible." "That's just it," Margaret continued. "I think there's more we could be doing. This group is wonderful, but it only meets once a week for an hour and a half. What about all the other hours when these women are sitting alone in their houses, drowning in grief and isolation?" Sarah found herself leaning forward, intrigued by the passion in Margaret's voice. "What are you thinking?" Barbara asked. Margaret's eyes were bright with an idea that was clearly taking shape as she spoke. "What if we created something more? Not to replace this group, but to supplement it. A place where newly widowed women could come anytime they needed support. A drop-in center, maybe, with resources and activities and just community." The room was quiet as everyone processed Margaret's suggestion. Finally, Sarah spoke up. "I think that's brilliant," she said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "When I was in my darkest period, the loneliness between these meetings was almost unbearable. Having somewhere to go, people to be with who understood." "Exactly," Margaret said, turning to Sarah with excitement. "And think about it. We have skills, experience, wisdom that we've gained through our grief journeys. What if we could use those gifts to help other women?" Barbara was nodding thoughtfully. "There are definitely gaps in the services available to grieving spouses. Most grief counseling is individual or in small groups like this, but you're talking about something more comprehensive." Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself thinking constantly about Margaret's idea. She began researching grief support services in the Atlanta area and was shocked to discover how limited the options were, especially for women over 50 who had lost their spouses. "Margaret," Sarah said during one of their coffee dates, "I can't stop thinking about your center idea. I keep imagining a place where women could come for practical help too. Learning to manage finances after losing a spouse, figuring out how to do household repairs, dealing with the hundreds of little tasks that their husbands might have handled." Margaret's face lit up. "Yes. And what about social activities? Potluck dinners, book clubs, maybe even group trips for women who are afraid to travel alone but don't want to give up seeing the world." Sarah felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Excitement about the future. "We could call it. What would we call it?" "Well," Margaret said with a smile, "what do widows need most?" Sarah thought for a moment. "Hope, community, a new beginning." "New Beginnings," Margaret said immediately. "That's it. New Beginnings Widow Support Center." That night, Sarah stayed up until 2 in the morning, researching non-profit organizations, writing notes, sketching out ideas for programs and services. She felt more energized and purposeful than she had since before David's death. You know, my dear friends, this is one of the most beautiful things about the human spirit, how our greatest pain can become the source of our greatest purpose. Sarah was discovering that her intimate knowledge of grief, her understanding of the particular challenges faced by widows, could be transformed into something that helped others. She called Margaret first thing the next morning. "I couldn't sleep," Sarah said as soon as Margaret answered the phone. "I kept thinking about the center, about what we could offer. Margaret, I think we could really do this." "I couldn't sleep either," Margaret laughed. "I was up making lists of potential programs. Sarah, I have to ask you something, and please be honest with me. Are you interested in this because you're genuinely excited about it, or because you think it's what you should do?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "A year ago, I would have said I'd never be passionate about anything again. But Margaret, when I think about being able to tell a newly widowed woman that the pain she's feeling won't last forever, when I imagine creating a place where women can laugh and cry and heal together, I feel alive again. More alive than I've felt since David died." "Then we're going to do this," Margaret said with determination. "We're going to create something beautiful from our pain." The next few months were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Sarah and Margaret attended city council meetings to understand zoning requirements. They met with lawyers to discuss non-profit status. They reached out to local churches and community organizations to gauge interest and support. Sarah found herself using skills she hadn't touched in years. Her background as a librarian proved invaluable for research and organizing information. Her natural empathy and understanding of grief made her an effective spokesperson when they presented their idea to potential supporters. "We're not trying to replace professional counseling or medical care," Sarah explained to the board of directors at the local community foundation. "We're trying to fill the gaps, to provide the kind of peer support and practical assistance that can make the difference between surviving grief and healing from it." Margaret's passion and energy were infectious. Despite being 70 years old, she had more enthusiasm for this project than many people half her age had for anything. She had connected with other widow support organizations around the country, gathering best practices and learning from their successes and challenges. "Sarah," Margaret said one afternoon, as they sat in what would eventually become their office space, a small building that the Methodist Church had agreed to rent to them at below market rates. "I need to tell you something. Before I met you, before this project, I was just existing, going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. You've given me back my sense of purpose." Sarah looked around the empty space, trying to envision it filled with comfortable chairs, bookshelves, maybe a small kitchen where women could share meals and stories. "You saved my life, Margaret. Literally, if you hadn't taken me under your wing, if you hadn't shown me that it was possible to carry grief without being destroyed by it. We saved each other," Margaret said simply, "and now we're going to help save other women too." The grand opening of New Beginnings was scheduled for a Saturday morning in October. exactly 3 years after David's death. Sarah woke up that morning with a mixture of nervousness and excitement that reminded her of her first day of work as a librarian 30 years earlier. She put on a blue dress, David's favorite color, on her, and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had lost her husband 3 years ago. She was older, certainly, with new lines around her eyes and silver threads in her hair. But there was something else there too. Strength, purpose, a quiet confidence that came from surviving the worst thing she could imagine and finding meaning on the other side. "I wish you could see this, David," she whispered to his photograph on her dresser. "I think you'd be proud." As she drove to the center that morning, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years ago, she had been convinced that her life was over, that everything meaningful had died with David. She had been so wrong. Her life hadn't ended when David died. It had changed, profoundly and painfully, but it hadn't ended. And now, she was about to begin a new chapter that would honor both her love for David and her commitment to helping other women find their way through the darkness of grief. The opening day of New Beginnings exceeded every expectation Sarah and Margaret had dared to have. By 10 in the morning, their small space was filled with women of all ages who had heard about the center through word of mouth, church announcements, and a small article in the local newspaper. There was Patricia, a 55-year-old whose husband had died suddenly of a heart attack just like David. There was Elena, a 62-year-old who had cared for her husband through a long battle with cancer. There was Joyce, 78 years old, who had been widowed for 6 months and was struggling with the practical aspects of living alone for the first time in 55 years. Sarah stood in the corner of the main room, watching Margaret lead an impromptu orientation session, and felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had created. These women had come seeking hope, community, understanding, exactly what Sarah and Margaret had dreamed of providing. "Sarah," a soft voice said beside her. Sarah turned to see a woman who looked to be in her early 50s, with red-rimmed eyes and the particular exhaustion that comes with fresh grief. "Are you one of the founders?" "I am," Sarah said gently. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. I'm Jennifer Walsh. My husband died 2 months ago. Cancer. I don't know why I'm here exactly. I saw the article in the paper and something just told me to come." Sarah's heart ached with recognition. Jennifer had that same lost, hollow look that Sarah remembered seeing in her own mirror 3 years earlier. "Jennifer, I'm so sorry for your loss. 2 months. You're still in the very hardest part." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "Everyone keeps telling me it will get better, but I can't imagine how. Frank was my everything. We were married for 26 years. I don't know how to be a person without him." Sarah gently guided Jennifer to a quieter corner of the room. "Can I tell you something? 3 years ago, I was exactly where you are right now. My husband David died suddenly of a heart attack. For 2 years, I was convinced that my life was over, that I would never feel anything but pain again." Jennifer looked skeptical. "But you're here. You're doing this amazing thing. You seem so together." Sarah smiled softly. "I'm not the same person I was when David was alive, Jennifer. That woman is gone, and I grieved for her too. But I discovered that there was another version of me waiting to emerge. Someone who could carry David's love forward while still building a meaningful life." "How?" Jennifer whispered. "How did you get from where I am to where you are?" "Very slowly," Sarah said, echoing the words Margaret had spoken to her years earlier. "And with a lot of help from people who understood. That's why we created this place. So women like you, like I was, don't have to find their way through grief alone." Over the next hour, Sarah found herself having similar conversations with woman after woman. Each story was different, but the core emotions were the same. The devastation, the loneliness, the fear that life would never have meaning again. Margaret approached her during a quiet moment. "How are you doing?" she asked, noticing the emotional intensity of Sarah's morning. "It's harder than I expected," Sarah admitted. seeing all these women in such pain, remembering how that felt. But look around, Margaret said, gesturing to the room where small groups of women were talking, some crying, some laughing, all connecting. Look what we've created in just one morning. Sarah looked around and saw Patricia showing Joyce how to use a smartphone to video call her grandchildren. She saw Elena explaining to Jennifer how to find a grief counselor. She saw women who had been strangers 3 hours earlier, exchanging phone numbers and making plans to meet for coffee. We did this, Margaret said quietly. We took our pain and transformed it into something that helps other people. Sarah, this is what healing looks like. Not forgetting our grief, but using it to create something beautiful. As the morning wound down, the women began making plans for the center's regular programming. They scheduled weekly drop-in hours, monthly potluck dinners, a book club that would focus on stories of resilience and hope. Joyce, despite being one of the oldest attendees, volunteered to lead a workshop on practical skills like basic home maintenance and car care. My Harold taught me everything about taking care of a house, she explained. No reason other women should have to learn by trial and error like I did after he passed. Patricia, who had been an accountant before retiring, offered to teach financial planning workshops. Learning to manage money alone after making financial decisions as a couple for 30 years. That's terrifying, she said, but it doesn't have to be impossible. Sarah found herself volunteering to facilitate a monthly remembrance circle where women could share favorite memories of their husbands without feeling like they needed to move on or get over it. Our loves don't die when our husbands do, Sarah explained. This will be a place where we can celebrate those relationships and keep those memories alive. As the last woman left that afternoon, Sarah and Margaret sat in their now quiet center, exhausted but exhilarated. I can't believe we actually did it, Sarah said, looking around at the space that had been transformed from an empty room into the beginning of something extraordinary. This is just the beginning, Margaret said with a smile. Sarah, do you realize what we've started here? This isn't just about helping a few women in Atlanta. This could be a model that other communities could replicate. Sarah nodded, already imagining the possibilities. We should document everything we do, track what works and what doesn't. Maybe write a guide for other women who want to start the similar centers in their communities. Over the following months, new beginnings grew beyond anything Sarah and Margaret had initially envisioned. Word spread through churches, doctors' offices, and social networks. Women drove from neighboring counties to participate in their programs. The center became a hub of activity and healing. The monthly potluck dinners regularly drew 40 or 50 women. The practical skills workshops were so popular that they had to offer them multiple times. The remembrance circles provided a safe space for women to honor their marriages while still moving forward with their lives. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah watched as woman after woman made the same journey she had made, from devastating grief to purposeful living. She saw Jennifer, the woman she had met on opening day, gradually emerge from her cocoon of pain to become one of their most dedicated volunteers. She watched as Patricia used her organizational skills to help other widows navigate the complex world of insurance and estate planning. You know what the most beautiful thing about this place is, Margaret said to Sarah one evening, as they closed up after a particularly busy day. It's that every woman who finds healing here becomes someone who can help the next woman who walks through our doors. We're not just helping individuals, we're creating a community of healers. Sarah smiled, thinking about how different her life was from what she had imagined 3 years earlier. She had thought her story ended when David died. Instead, she had discovered that it was simply the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Margaret, Sarah said, I need to tell you something. When David and I made our retirement plans, we dreamed about traveling and seeing the world. I thought those dreams died with him. But working here, seeing the impact we're making, feeling this sense of purpose, this is better than any trip we could have taken. This is the most meaningful thing I've ever done. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Robert always said that the best way to honor love is to spread love. I think that's what we're doing here. We're taking the love our husbands gave us and multiplying it, sharing it with women who desperately need to know that love still exists in the world. 6 months after opening, New Beginnings received a grant from the Community Foundation to expand their programming. Sarah and Margaret were able to hire a part-time coordinator and add support groups for specific populations: young widows, widows with children still at home, and widows dealing with sudden versus anticipated loss. Sarah also returned to work, but not as a librarian. She became the program director for New Beginnings, using her organizational skills and deep understanding of grief to develop new services and support existing ones. "I never thought I'd work again after David died," Sarah told Jessica during one of their weekly phone calls. "I was convinced that the part of me that could contribute to the world was gone forever." "Mom, you're contributing more now than you ever did," Jessica said. "Not that your work at the library wasn't important, but this is changing lives. You're changing lives." Jessica was right. In just 1 year, New Beginnings had served over 300 women. They had expanded to offer online support groups for women in rural areas. They had created a mentorship program, pairing newly widowed women with those further along in their grief journey. Most importantly to Sarah, they had created a model that other communities were beginning to replicate. A group in Nashville had opened their own New Beginnings Center. Another was being planned in Phoenix. "We're starting a movement," Margaret said to Sarah on the first anniversary of the center's opening. "We're changing how society supports grieving spouses." That evening, Sarah stood in her backyard, looking up at the stars. 3 years earlier, in this same spot, she had been unable to imagine a future worth living. Tonight, she was planning workshops for the next quarter, preparing for a speaking engagement at a national conference on grief support, and looking forward to a weekend trip with Margaret to visit the Nashville Center. "David," she said quietly to the stars, "I hope you can see what your love helped create. I hope you know that losing you broke me, but it also led me to discover a strength I never knew I had. Our love didn't end when you died. It just changed form. Now it's helping other women find their way back to life after loss." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree that David had planted when they first moved into the house. And Sarah smiled, feeling his presence in a way that brought comfort rather than pain. My dear friends, as I finish sharing Sarah's story with you, I want you to take a moment to like this video. If it touched your heart, subscribe to our channel so you never miss these incredible stories of resilience and hope. And please, leave me a comment, telling me what you thought of Sarah's journey. Have you experienced a loss that felt devastating? Do you know someone who might benefit from hearing about Sarah's transformation? Sarah's story reminds us that our greatest pain can become our greatest purpose, that the love we've shared never truly dies. It just finds new ways to express itself in the world. At 53, Sarah has discovered that life after loss isn't about getting back to who you were before. It's about honoring who you were while becoming who you're meant to be. And before I say goodbye, don't forget about those wonderful natural products I mentioned earlier. They're still waiting for you in the description below. These supplements have been such a blessing for sleep, stress relief, and overall wellness during life's challenging transitions. Your support helps us continue bringing you these inspiring stories that remind us all of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Remember, my loves, no matter what loss you've experienced, no matter how broken you feel right now, there is still hope. There is still purpose waiting for you. There is still love to give and receive. Sarah's story is proof that even in our darkest valley, there is always a path leading back to the light. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love to transform even our deepest pain into something beautiful.